Welcome to the Seahawks Forever podcast. In-depth analysis on everything Seahawks. And now, here's your host, Dan Viens.
What's up, everybody? Coming to you live from Mobile, Alabama, side of the Senior Bowl. And as soon as I touched down, news broke. Shout out to Shane Turner, longtime follower of mine from down under in Australia. Yeah, that's about as good of an accent as you're going to get from me. Broke the news to me, and then everything hit. Thank you to the Seahawks for waiting until I landed to break the news so that we can be semi-current in getting into this. Bryce Coots joining me from the Hawk Zone Rundown podcast and also my co-host on The Pick Is In. Bryce, your initial thoughts. Clint Kubiak, after an exhaustive search, the new offensive coordinator replacing Ryan Grubb for the Seattle Seahawks.
Well, for me, when the names came out of, who we had interviewed and to that point, who had come in for second interviews, Kubiak was always my kind of choice. I think his offense, the Shanahan West Coast offense, merits to what Mike McDonald wanted in a lot of ways. And he's got experience. He's still young too. He's only 37, so he's around the same age as Mike McDonald, if not the same age. But he had NFL experience of 11 years. He had 3 years of calling plays in the NFL. You're still getting a young guy, but you're not getting a guy totally inexperienced. Now, the Fraley-Udinski combo that we had all kind of been talking about and potentially could have happened, and maybe this, and Fraley decides to stay in Detroit. That was choice number 2 for me. I was really excited that ended up being a possibility as well. But I think for Mike McDonald, after doing it and probably, going back and forth over how he wanted it to look going forward, I think he got a guy that's going to be able to build a good staff around himself in Seattle, bring in some, other experienced coaches, and kind of, also has an ability to develop quarterbacks. He's done a really good job when he's been a quarterback coach or involved in his quarterback position in developing quarterbacks. So that was always the other kind of thing is, yes, Udinski had been involved with it if he had been named the guy, but you're now getting a guy with more experience having done that. And also the fact he can pull from resources or information, whether it's Mike Shanahan, Gary Kubiak, he has a plethora because he's been an NFL family. So, you know what? At the end of the day, they did their due diligence, and there's names coming out now of guys that we didn't even know they'd interviewed. Adam Stenovich, Travis Switzer from Baltimore. So it wasn't like it was just 3 names and that was it. They did some very deep digging with this, and I think they came away with the guy that is going to be best suited to help them going forward in the ideology of this offense that they want to have.
I think the search kind of mirrors what we have learned about Mike McDonald and sort of how his brain works and kind of his approach. He's very, very thorough, and he was going to turn over every rock and every stone. And what I liked about the search is that they were very unconventional in how they went about it. The Hank Fraley thing, I think a lot of us became enamored with the idea of a guy that spent 10 years in the NFL playing in the trenches as a center, living it, right? Living that mentality that Mike McDonald wants to execute on the offensive line and the kind of mentality that he wants to spread throughout that offense. But he had never done it before. And that was kind of the intrigue of it all. And, going back and forth over the last 4 or 5 weeks with fans, and how these searches go, it seems like sometimes the early candidate, if they're not the hire right away, they lose a little bit of luster. Right? It's just kind of human nature. And people start to question, well, what was wrong with them? And it sort of felt there for a minute like they really wanted Fraley. That was their plan A. And what got a little concerning as the week went along and it dragged on and we weren't getting any new definitive information. Obviously now, as you touched on, we're hearing now some of this stuff was happening behind the scenes. But it felt like, okay, now they're going to lose Kubiak too if they miss out on Fraley because he's not going to just want to be the bridesmaid, right? But of all the candidates, and you and I talked about this last week, if Clint Kubiak had been a quick hire, right? They'd gone out, done the Rooney Rule thing, interviewed 3 or 4 names, hired Clint Kubiak the first week, I would have been excited about it. I think I would have called it a solid hire. I think most people would have been happy about it. It's just that it dragged on, that it sort of took on this life of its own.
It really did. And, like we just talked about, and you just talked about, Dan, Mike McDonald was going to be diligent with this. He wasn't just going to jump. He wanted to go through the process. He alluded to it in his end of the season press conference where he said, like, now, yes, it sucks that we're out of this, but I have more time to kind of go through this process fully and get my guy. And I think that's the key thing with Mike Macdonald. Yes, some people, may think Fraley was the guy, and he may very well it may have been a situation of Kubiak and Fraley were both, and either way, it didn't matter how it went. It was whoever wanted the job first was going to kind of end up being the guy. And Fraley clearly wanted to stay in Detroit, which I understand. He's got family there. He's got, a big family for that matter there. He's always been kind of a Midwest guy out on the East there. Like, he hasn't gone very far except for his 1 year in San Diego. So it makes sense. He got his promotion as run game coordinator, which, you and me talked about before it even got announced. And I said, this is what was going to happen. He was going to get his run game, coordinator promotion. And then they pivoted to a guy that they interviewed first. And if you remember, Mike Garafolo said Kubiak was the front runner. So he may have still been the front runner at that point. So it's going to make it very interesting to see how this offensive staff is going to be built. What does this mean for Geno Smith is another interesting, caveat to this, because Kubiak has had experience working with veteran quarterbacks, Derek Carr, Kirk Cousins, and he's got a lot out of them. So do we see kind of a backwards renaissance for Geno to what he was in 2002 and 2003, where, he had less interceptions, more touchdowns. He was, not making the same critical mistakes potentially. It'll be interesting to see how this all kind of shapes up. I'm really excited for the hire. Kubiak for me was the guy that I was most excited about if they got him, because just knowing his offense, knowing where it comes from, it's what you kind of want to tap into in the NFL. And he has some interesting use of tight ends and even fullbacks.
Yeah, it's funny. It's obviously a what have you done for me lately league. And, Kubiak was a hot candidate, a year ago, 2 years ago. He was a guy that I wanted to be involved in the search last year and never really got into it. And then, the Saints get off to that roaring start last year. They scored 91 points in their first 2 weeks, and then they get struck by the injury bug. And they just, especially when Derek Carr went out, they had some injuries on the offensive line. Their wide receiver room was decimated. It's the last thing fans remember. And so, well, what happened then? Did the league figure him out? But what I do like is, first of all, I pulled this up, and this was a sort of a capsule summary, right at the very beginning of the search when it was announced that he was the first interview. And this is a sort of a summary that was posted, basically going over kind of his main tenets and beliefs and philosophies and his foundation of his scheme. He prefers wide zone run scheme, but he says he caters to the personnel on hand. So that's his preference. But if the players that he has at his disposal are better at gap or inside zone, he'll cater to that. Heavy play action, heavy 2 and 3 man route concepts, heavy 12 and 13 personnel, lots of motion, right? He's a guy that prefers to build things around the run. And I think the biggest criticism of Ryan Grubb last year was, the modern renaissance in offense that we've seen. It's kind of been driven by, not just, we talk about McVay and Shanahan all the time, but it goes back to, Holmgren and then Reed. And it's all about making everything look the same when it's different and making everything look different when it's the same. Right. And deception and mystery and intrigue almost in disguise. He has that background. He's from the Shanahan tree. Obviously, his dad played for Mike Shanahan with the Denver Broncos. And then I like that when he went to Minnesota, he went there with his dad as the offensive coordinator. So he got to see up close and personal. He's worked with Norv Turner before. That's an interesting influence. And the quarterback stuff that you mentioned, he's had success with a veteran, got maybe Kirk Cousins' best year out of him. And with a young quarterback, last year as a passing game coordinator, had an influence on Brock Purdy, his best full season that he's had in the league. And when you talk about the Seahawks and what we expect them to do over the next 2 to 3 years, they got a veteran now. They want to win with him now. But at some point, hopefully this April, they're going to draft a guy to develop too. And we got to see a little bit of that also last year because of the injury to Derek Carr, and Kubiak had to go with Spencer Rattler as a starter. And he didn't light the world on fire, but we saw some good things. Just the fact that he's had the experience of having to manage that situation, I think bodes well.
It does. And the thing that's going to be very interesting with Clint Kubiak and what he's able to do with this offense is how much does it change? How much does our personnel potentially change to fit? Like you said, he's a very big 12 and 13 personnel guy. So that means our tight end room is going to need some work to be done. Does that mean that Noah Fant comes back, or does he change it? Is Juwan Johnson, who's a free agent, potentially, the guy that they go to because he's got, and that's the thing that's going to be interesting is how many guys does Shane Lemieux, who's a guard that's 27, end up coming to Seattle? Does, there's always an interesting pull when guys get jobs. They like to pull guys with them that have been good. And, that's where it's going to be interesting to see how this shapes up. But the thing with Clint and what's so interesting is, like you said, his dad played for Mike Shanahan. His dad coached with Mike Shanahan for a couple of years there in Denver with John Elway. He's seen that whole progression of how that offense has changed. Then he gets on Kyle's staff in San Francisco. He gets to see how it's been modernized a bit. Like, he's been around the entirety and he understands the inner workings of this offense. It's not like a guy that's trying to walk into it like when we had Shane Waldron, who had been around everywhere and then kind of had a year or two with McVay, and then everyone thinks he's a McVay guy. He didn't grow up in the system. Clint has grown up in the system, and this might be, in some respects, the most talented skill position set he's had to work with as an offensive coordinator, because he's going to have, a DK, a JSN, the running backs we have. It'll be very interesting to see how this all kind of shapes up for Clint, and just what kind of moves do they make in free agency now, because they finally do have their OC. And this affects even Senior Bowl now, because they're going to have the ability to know an idea of what they may want to look at when it comes to drafting players.
Yeah, some of those names are cool that you mentioned. And we always expect a coach to want to bring some of his guys with them. And I'm still shocked and flabbergasted to this day that no Ravens made their way, to the Seahawks roster last year, along with Mike Macdonald, or coaches for that matter. But in this case, you hit on some good ones. I remember really liking Shane Lemieux when he came out of Oregon in the draft that year, because I think he's played some center too, and he's one of those guys that can do a little bit of everything. And then even a guy like Marquez Valdez-Scantling, who they pulled off the street last month, 6 weeks of the season, he was their best receiver. He's a big, tall, long guy. That's something that outside of DK Metcalf, of course, this receiver room kind of lacks. He might be interesting. There's a lot going on there. And I know we're going to get to the comments and the questions here in a minute. They're going to ask about coaching staff and what might happen to the rest of the staff. How do you feel just generally about how the search was conducted by Mike Macdonald and John Schneider?
I think it's interesting. I think part of the reason everyone got so antsy and kind of just tightened up about this search is because it was different than how searches were conducted under Pete Carroll. They didn't go very long with Pete. Pete kind of had his Rolex decks of cards of guys he had worked with in the past, and it was like, okay, 1, 2, bang, and I've got my guy. Like, it wasn't an exhausted search. So going through this process, what we're learning about this new staff, this new regime that's being brought in, is they're going to be thorough. They're going to overturn and look under every nook and cranny around there about, who's the right fit, who's the right guy. And that's something that's kind of encouraging, because when he did it on his defensive staff with Durde and, a bunch of the guys he's brought in on that, you saw the benefits. Our defense went from being something that was really, really scary to watch the last couple of years with Pete, and even the beginning of the year was a bit of a problem, to when it all started to come together, you could see how good it's going to get. And so now that he's been able, I think, truly to have a more of a say, not saying Mike Macdonald didn't have a say in the Ryan Grubb hire, because we found out at the press conference when Greg Bell asked that he definitely had some say in it. I think he's been able to actually focus putting this together more this time around in the offseason, knowing what he really wants, having been an head coach for a year, to go get the guy that's going to bring that vision forward to what matches his defense.
I know the conversation is going to get into who else might be coming aboard on the staff here in just a minute when we get to the questions and comments. Are you a little bit concerned about this? Because Kubiak has a name, because he's been in the league for a long time as a young guy. because he has called plays. He's had some success. We're back to that kind of square one a little bit, aren't we? Where if he goes out and the Seahawks offense looks markedly better and they have a good year, he might be a head coaching candidate and they might lose him next year.
Potentially. I think it's a potential thing with Clint Kubiak. And here's the interesting thing, and this is something I noticed in this entire NFL coaching carousel this year, whether it was Rob Saleh, Cohen down in Tampa Bay before he took the Jaguars job, is I think you're going to see now teams start paying these coordinators more money to keep them in-house, and instead, because a lot of it too is the pay bump you get going from coordinator to head coach. That's why a lot of these guys jump at that opportunity. And that's where I think it'll be interesting, because I think with Clint Kubiak, the one thing, yes, he's got a name, but he hasn't necessarily lit the NFL on fire like McVay did when he was an OC, or Kyle Shanahan. I think he's more on actually the trajectory of Kyle's, where Kyle had to go through being in Cleveland. Kyle had to go through being in Washington. Kyle then went to Atlanta, and then Kyle got his head coaching job. And it took Kyle 3 or 4 stints of actual success before he really got his opportunity. I think Clint Kubiak probably is going to be here for at least 3 years, is what I guess is probably. And that was, you know what? I bet you that was part of the discussions on this. And guys, how quickly are you looking to, become a head coach? Because I think Mike Macdonald is looking for someone like when Pete hired Darrell Bevell, that was here from 2012 or 2011, I should say, to 2017. He wants someone that's going to be here for a long time, especially on the offensive side. I don't think he's worried about the defense as much, because it's still his thing. And in worst case, he just resorts to calling plays. If he ever handed them off to anybody, he just takes that duty back. But on the offensive side, I think he's truly looking for someone that he can grow with. And I think that was a big part. And maybe that's why it took so long. Maybe that was a big caveat of it.
Yeah, it had to be part of the discussion. It had to be part of the process. And maybe, they had to feel like they got some assurances from Kubiak that he wouldn't be quick to jump at the first job that came along. We are seeing that happen more often. Obviously, Ben Johnson last year had multiple opportunities to be a head coach, could have coached the Commanders, chose to stay. Marcus Brady just announced that he's not going to pursue the Saints job anymore, which might have been an easy decision for him, because that Saints job is kind of a train wreck. Tough situation to step into, but still another example of a guy who prefers to stay in a good situation with a chance to win with the team he's with until that ideal situation comes along as head coach. That has to be part of the process, because they can't do this every year, especially if they're thinking about drafting a young quarterback. Let's see what some people have to say. First one right off the bat, always first in. Hell yes, Clint Kubiak. I think we're going to see some mostly positive reaction from this one. I know people get enamored with the mystery of the unknown, right? The Udinsky kid, I think, got a lot of sort of buzz just because of what he could be. But man, a lot of those guys fail because they just haven't cut their teeth enough. Not upset about this. Here we go. Now, who will be the key O-line run coordinator for Kubiak? We really need a strong O-line coach. Who's left out there? So Scott Huff, offensive line coach, Jake Peets, passing game coordinator, still under contract, still Seahawks as we sit here today. We know that Peets interviewed, I think in Chicago, right? Don't know that haven't heard Huff interviewing anywhere. The expectation would be that maybe if the Seahawks don't retain him, maybe he would go wherever Ryan Grubb ends up next. But Kubiak has some interesting connections, right? He was only in New Orleans for 1 year, but Rick Dennison is a name that's come up, longtime NFL veteran. He's been an offensive assistant. He's had offensive line coaching experience. And then Corbin Smith just brought up the name John Benton recently, since this news broke. Coached the 49ers offensive line from 19 to 21. Very, very good years in San Francisco for that offensive line in a very similar run scheme. So he may be a guy, but I would think we would hear something about that soon, because this process took so long, and because Kubiak had his second in-person interview over a week ago. He's had time to talk to Scott Huff, visit with him, get a feel for him. That decision has probably been made, don't you think?
I think it has. And the interesting thing, so when Clint Kubiak was the OC in 2021 with Minnesota, his running back coach was Kennedy Palomalu, who's on our staff. So there's a connection right there,
yeah,
right? So that's an interesting one. He had Phil Roshire, who was basically crucial in developing and executing that zone blocking scheme. So he's an O-line coach. Receiver coach is another interesting one. Our guys, obviously the coach for the Seahawks is down in Mobile at Senior Bowl, but
yeah,
Keenan
that would indicate to
McCardell,
me he's probably safe, I would think.
yeah, but Keenan McCardell is another name that's potentially another coach. And so it'll be very interesting. Like Butch Berry's another guy that he worked with in Denver who, understands the run and pass game. So it's going to be really interesting to see who Clint Kubiak is able to bring with him and how many guys on the staff he wants to potentially move on from. I'm almost certain I think he's going to hire a run game coordinator. And, I think that's probably going to be a run game coordinator, O-line tag job kind of a deal. I would be very surprised if Scott Huff is back. From things I'm hearing, I think it'd be very, very interesting to see that he's back. And I can't imagine he's going to be back, honestly, with you, Dan. If what I'm hearing is true, I think he's basically just kind of, they've kept him here. If things worked out, great. But the majority of the things I'm hearing is that he's probably going to be moved on from.
And when it comes to pass game coordinator, if they hire one, not everybody does. It sounds like Jake Peetz is out. Like
yes.
The fact that he wasn't given any consideration. In fact, when he was asked if there would be any in-house considerations for the OC position, Mike McDonald shot that down hard. And then, they've been allowing him to interview elsewhere. Something clearly is off there. What about Scott Turner? We heard his name inserted into the search late last week, but it was kind of within the context of maybe a guy that would work with Fraley or Stenovich as a guy with an offensive line background. But the fact that Clint Kubiak has history and worked under Norv Turner early in his career, connections matter in the NFL, and those relationships matter. And I wonder, maybe the Scott Turner news that came out last week was more related to Kubiak than it would have been to Fraley.
Yeah, it very well may have. And Albert Breer's pretty tied into the Seahawks organization, especially John Schneider's camp. He's very close there. So it's interesting that Scott Turner's name came up. I'm going to be interested with the passing game coordinator spot because I wonder if you see, potentially, Scott Turner could be the guy just because, again, familiarity brings a little bit of a different kind of influence from there due to his dad, Norv Turner, having the Air Coryell system be a big part of his passing game. It'll be interesting to see kind of who they bring in. Now, that's where I'm interested with, who he's had to work with in the past, like Keenan McCardell. When, he was with Denver, there was Zach Annecy, who worked basically, again, in designing the passing game with Kubiak. When Kubiak was the passing game coordinator. So does he bring him along with him and get that? So this is what I mean, which is kind of exciting a little bit about Kubiak is he has ties. He has more connections because of his long tenure in the NFL so far and him still being so young. It's not like we're getting a guy and again, Udinski, I think would have been an interesting candidate, but who's he pulling from? Who's he able to bring into the situation? He's only been in the league for a short period of time. Most of his connections would come, part of that team, Matt Rule's team, went back and his staff went back to college with him. So he's pulling from Minnesota. That's where I think the biggest thing when we looked at when they were talking about the inexperience factor is it a guy that hasn't had play calling experience, but has been in the NFL for 12 to 15 years and has his own Rolodex of coaches he's worked with versus a guy that's been inexperienced and like Ryan Grubb doesn't have that. And that was the big issue. Grubb didn't have anybody to really pull from when it came to hiring coaches. Like most of his staff that he knew and had worked with closely all went to Alabama with Kalen DeBoer. So he didn't have Scott Huff was really his only pull to Seattle. The rest of it kind of got pieced together around him.
I'll say this too, for people that were freaking out and look, there were moments where I kind of was too, just because we wanted answers, that it happened so late in the process, it dragged on. They're way ahead of where they were this time a year ago. They didn't have a head coach at this time a year ago. And then after Mike McDonald was hired, it took a few more weeks to hire the offensive coordinator. So they were way behind on that. They've gotten a jump start. Mike Macdonald is into his offseason prep with his staff that remains, certainly on the defensive side of the ball. It'll be interesting to see. I'll have my eyes out down here in Mobile. How many of the offensive coaches actually show up down here. If Kubiak shows up down here, I would imagine maybe he doesn't. He's busy hiring staff. He's got work to do right now. One thing that I found fascinating about his offense, and I wasn't sure about this, but given the San Francisco ties, the Shanahan ties, it makes sense. Went back and watched some of the early games in New Orleans last year, and I had to stop myself and remind myself what a fullback is. He used a fullback. New Orleans actually has a fullback on the roster, listed as a fullback. It's all he does. I can't wait to see if he actually does that, if that's something they try to acquire, or just the fact that, he's got a guy like Zach Charbonnet in hand. They've got a talented running back room. I've been screaming for years. I mean, going all the way back to Chris Carson and Rashad Penny, get those guys on the field at the same time, stress the defense, give them more things to have to adapt to. And now with that combination of Ken Walker and Zach Charbonnet, we saw a little bit of it last year from Ryan Grubb. We saw a little bit of it. And we saw a little bit of it from Shane Waldron too, although less. But let's get those guys on the field at the same time. And he does use some two-back stuff, which is cool.
He does, and that's what's going to be interesting. Like, I think what'll be interesting is to see maybe they don't get a traditional fullback, but maybe you go with a H-back, like a Kyle Juszczyk from San Francisco. You get a guy that can play fullback, but can also be part of your tight end package when you go to 12 or 13 personnel, and he's a weapon, and he's someone you can use. And that's where I wonder, we had a Brady Russell. Brady Russell needs to be healthy for that to be his job. He's kind of ideally built for that, but that's where I thought kind of last year when we went into training camp, Westover was going to fit in. I thought he was going to be like our fullback, H-back kind of guy because he had the body, he had the ability to do it, and he did a bit of it at UW, and it never materialized due to injury. But that's where I'm kind of interested to see, and this is where I think we may not see the same crazy pass concepts deep down the field we saw with Ryan Grubb. Ryan Grubb was very good at designing those. What I think you will see now, though, is a very well-established play-action game built off of a run game where it actually merits what you're doing and they work together rather than being this broken puzzle piece where we have to do play action, but we don't really have anything built into our offense off of our run game. So we're just going to fake, our play action to the weak side, even though we don't run the ball there, because that way it looks like we're doing play action. Like, that's how it felt with Ryan Grubb. Or with Kubiak, I think it's going to be more of the, hey, we've been running wide zone, now we're going to boot. And that's the other thing with Kubiak. A lot of that Shanahan, McVay, that West Coast, Bill Walsh tree down, booting your quarterback off of run fakes is a big part of it. We've seen it with Brock Purdy for a while. We've seen it with Matt Stafford.
I've been wanting to see that. Yeah, Geno does that well.
He does it well,
and
so that's going to be, I think, a thing you're going to see come into this offense. And I don't think you're going to see a almost 70 to 80% shotgun rate on this offense going forward. I think we'll see more of the under center stuff, which we've been craving.
Yeah, that would drive me crazy, especially when the offensive line was struggling to protect. How, Geno's mobile enough. He throws well on the run to either side. Like, get him out and move him. We see it. I want what other teams do well. I want some of this stuff that we see these really good teams in the playoffs do well that we don't. It's probably not a coincidence. It's the reason they're still playing. Which, by the way, about halfway through the third quarter, this Buffalo Kansas City game it's good. It's a good game. 5-point game. Kansas City still in the lead. I don't know. We're not going to talk about that. So got the start here. Thanks for the super thanks, McVirus6185. Now knowing the OC, who are you going to focus more on? To me, the priority right now is offensive line coach, right? That's the guy you got to lock up first and foremost. We have to know who's coaching that group. And ideally, it's kind of a shame that's not in place because you'd like to have that guy in Mobile. This is a good offensive line group down here, and there's a bunch of guys that the Seahawks might serve them well to get their eyes on. But I would imagine that's next. But like I said earlier, I think we're going to find out quickly. I think this didn't just break. This wasn't just like a late Sunday night news dump, as they often are, and then there's a delay. The Seahawks came out and officially announced this.
Yeah.
And that's kind of unusual. Shortly after the news broke, they confirmed it with their own press release. That tells me, I think part of the delay the last couple of weeks is they getting their ducks in a row, and we're going to find out over the next couple of days who the rest of the staff is. That's my hunch.
I think that's a very safe hunch to have. I think it's, and again, we'll never know the exact timeline of how things went. Obviously, we heard, because of Fraley's wife, that they were staying in Detroit. We're not going to Chicago. People assume that means that Seattle was going through it the whole way to the end there. And it could have been after that second interview, things didn't work. And Fraley pivoted to potentially Chicago as an option. And Seattle was done and out of the way. Like, they may have come out of that second interview and go, okay, Hank Fraley, isn't our guy. Let's try and figure this out with Klint. And they may have been this entire week figuring out the contract, his staff, all that stuff. So, like, when it got announced, it was bang, 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 and we're off and running because we got Senior Bowl, we got all this stuff. So there's nothing to say that, the whole Fraley thing took a week long. It could have very well been that just, hey, after the second interview, the things weren't going to work out. Hank may have said, hey, look, this is what Dan Campbell's already told me, because don't forget, it wasn't until I think Tuesday Hank Fraley came and actually was in person for his interview in Seattle. So after that loss for the Lions on the Saturday, by Monday, Dan Campbell would have said, hey, look, go for your second interview, but this is what I have here for you. You will become our run game coordinator. You'll get that promotion, so on and so forth. And, go to Seattle, see if the offer is better and you want to, move your family there. And he may have gone to Seattle and been like, hey, look, this is what Dan's presented to me, beat it. And, that's what it's going to take for me to potentially move here and move my family. And that's a big thing. So it wasn't necessarily that the Hank Fraley thing went all week. It could have been over really quick in that first week. We'll never know. And then they were just working on getting Clint's whole thing built together.
And remember the reports last week that it was Garofalo again. I think he was all over this thing. And really everything he said kind of has come to fruition now. He was the first one late in the week too to say he thinks we'll hear something by early next week, which I would qualify late Sunday night as early next week. But the fact that Clint Kubiak was the first in-person interview and ends up being the hire, and then we had those reports that they were that they were looking at a shared responsibility relationship. It could just be because, again, this is Mike Macdonald has a big brain. It's one of the first things John Schneider said about him, right? We've seen that now. We got to see it throughout the season, how that operates. I think hopefully he's not one of those guys that gets paralysis by analysis and overthinks things, right? I don't think this was that case. This is his first real extensive shot with the benefit of a full offseason to put a staff together. I think it's possible that Kubiak was the choice all along to lead this thing. They were trying to fit these other cool pieces together with it, and it just didn't work. Maybe they were trying to get some sort of arrangement where Kubiak and Fraley would both be here because they wanted part of what, Fraley has helped build in Detroit with that offensive line and with that culture and that identity that they have down there. So maybe Kubiak has been the guy the whole time. And they just couldn't get the pieces all fit together in the right way.
And that's very true. And the one thing I had heard a couple different times from people that I've connected with and talked to, and they said there was kind of some hiccups, again, with what you're talking about, trying to fit these pieces together, of if Fraley was to be the guy potentially, what is the passing game coordinator situation? And one of the things was he really wanted Antoine Randall to come with him. Well, Antoine Randall didn't want to come to Seattle. He wanted to go to Chicago with Ben Johnson. Where did he end up? He ended up in Chicago with Ben Johnson. And Chicago just hired their offensive coordinator now, which is Declan Doyle, who is the tight ends coach for the Broncos. And again, he's young. He's 28, but he's a rising star. And the thing that'll be interesting, and this is the thing I'm going to watch, is the Saints are now the last job left. And it sounds like it's down to Kellen Moore and Mike McCarthy potentially for that job. Does Grant Udinski get an opportunity as an OC in one of those spots, or is he still in play in Seattle as maybe the passing game coordinator? He could very well be. He would know the system because it's a derivative off of McVay. So if he gets a bump and comes out here, maybe that's an option. Like, Udinski might not be off the table still, even though we hired Kubiak. He could still very much be in play for a passing game coordinator.
You just reminded me of a thought, though. The name Mike McCarthy entered into this race late because of the relationship that he and John Schneider have. And Schneider has spoken in reverential tones about Mike McCarthy. And so there was a thought that maybe if he doesn't get a head coaching job this cycle, he'd be the perfect guy to bring in and just let him run the offense for a year and let Mike Macdonald focus on the defense. He doesn't have to worry about it, right? I wonder if the timing of this announcement isn't a coincidence, given that Marcus or that Joe Brady pulled his name out yesterday, and now Mike McCarthy appears to maybe be the front runner with the Saints. Maybe there was some movement there and some discussion with McCarthy. We may never know. So this is a mindset that I know that a lot of fans are going to have. And I think it was one of the more intriguing things about the whole search is you had, Kubiak was really the only guy that had significant play calling experience. Everybody else was an unknown. I mentioned earlier how that's kind of sexy, right? That's kind of alluring to some people, that like what he could be. Ooh, this 28-year-old kid, he could be the next McVay. Like, let's get in on that. Sorry, I put up the wrong comment. It was, where's the one that I meant to put? Here we go. Saints had a below average offense last year. Well, we touched on that. They blew the doors off the thing the first few weeks, scored 91 points in the first 2 weeks, and they were doing it. They were hitting deep shots. Kamara looked like he was 23 years old again. The offense was varied. It was diverse. They were running the football. They were throwing the football. And then they lost Ryan Ramczyk. And then Kamara got banged up, and then all their receivers got hurt, and then Carr got hurt, and they had to go the last 2/3 of the season with Jake Haener and Spencer Rattler. So again, it's what have you done for me lately? I'd hate to judge a guy too harshly on. I mean, context matters, right? And some people might want to brush that away as, well, you're making excuses for him. But every other candidate that they interviewed had never called plays. So how can that be better? I mean, I get it, but that's where I'm at. I think it's a good hire. I think it's a solid hire. Doesn't mean it's guaranteed to work. There's still some other things that need to be done. They have to give him a better offensive line up front. But I think it's a good hire. I kind of think it might end up being, when we look back on it, might be the best hire they could have made.
I think that's a very key statement, Dan. I think it might be the best hire they could have made in the long run if you look at it, and it's something that could be very interesting. The thing that'll be interesting for me, and this is where I kind of wonder with Mike Macdonald where his head was at, is we saw a team this year offensively that was extremely drop back pass happy. Like we were a very high drop back pass rating team. The one thing about the Shanahan offense, and the one thing that it's kind of had its knock, is it doesn't have a very robust drop back passing game. It doesn't. And so I think what Mike Macdonald may have been thinking is, hey, look, this guy is really good at setting up the run. He's really good with play action, quick game, those type of things. He's better built to match our defense where we're going to be potentially in tighter games and controlling the clock and doing those things than having an all shootout pass deep offense. And so that's where I think you see again where their minds went with some of these OCs are guys that are, potentially used to playing. Even when you look at Stenovich and you look at Travis Switzer, who they interviewed from the Ravens and the Packers respectively, again, guys that are used to having closer games. And I think that's what Mike Macdonald wants to do. Like, not saying he doesn't want to blow people out. I'm sure he'd be very happy with, 47 to nothing wins. That'd be great. But looking at who's in his division, and again, that's another part of this. Kubiak might be able to help, not that Mike Macdonald may need it, but give him more insight into how Shanahan and McVay's systems work because he's grown up in them. He knows it. He knows the inner workings of these systems. Again, it's another resource from Mike Macdonald going, hey, when we line up like this, how do you want to attack us based on the system that you've grown up in? Like, what are the principles of it? And give Mike more information that he may not have already.
I can't find the comment now, but somebody, so shout out to whoever it was, asked earlier about what type of offensive lineman would work best in a Kubiak scheme. If his preference is wide zone, that lends itself to athletic guys that can move, correct?
It does, and that's been kind of the thing about Shanahan's offense.
Are you frozen?
And where McVay's differed with his in the last few years is McVay kind of, after their initial Super Bowl run with Goff, they changed and went to a power gap run scheme. And then now Shanahan, I think, is going to try and do the same. The wide zone works, but the problem is you can get bullied by it if teams have better D tackles than you and better linebackers. So it'll be very interesting to see how it all plays out for them in that regard.
We're having some Wi-Fi issues here in the hotel room, unfortunately. Hopefully that won't be too.
Oh, I think Dan did have the Wi-Fi issue kind of cut out there for him in Mobile. Okay, I will try answering some of these guys for you in the chat. Clearly, yeah, Dan had some Wi-Fi issues, and I don't actually have control. Geno Smith's future is going to be very interesting. I see Deep Sea 1,900, 300. It's going to be interesting. It lends to potentially be the fact that Geno could fit what Kubiak wants to do. He could also potentially not fit, and Kubiak may decide that he wants to go with a rookie quarterback. I remember listening a few weeks ago to Matt Hasselbeck talk about when Seattle moved off Jeremy Bates and moved to Tavares Jackson and Darrell Bevel. They went through a situation where they told Matt that, hey, look, we're going a new direction, new OC, new quarterback. This is the easiest way for us to cut it clean. So it'll be interesting to see how that all kind of shapes up that way. For Geno, I think they're still going to keep Geno around. It just helps out that way, but we'll have to see how that kind of all shapes out. And we're going to find out quick. I think we'll find out stuff about Geno probably in the next couple of weeks here. I think there's going to be some rumble about what they're going to do at the quarterback position, but it'll be interesting. Oh, we got Dan back.
Yeah, I think the whole thing crashed and came back. So I'm not sure. The Wi-Fi here in the hotel room, a little concerning. Hopefully it gets better as the week goes along, but tonight, not great. So thank you all for being patient and hanging with us. Are you still there, Bryce?
I'm still here.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
All right. Because of technical difficulties, it looks like the Wi-Fi is really taking a turn for the worse here. My apologies for that, everybody. If you can still hear me, just know that I'll be here in Mobile all week covering the Senior Bowl. I'll be going live every day. And if this Wi-Fi situation isn't going to work, I'll find another place to do it. And if I'll go live from a Starbucks if I have to, or just do shorter videos from my phone. But I'll be taking a close and personal look.
Oh, I think Dan had his technical difficulty issue again. So, yeah, I think that's it for that, everyone. So, just on another note, tonight 8:30 Hawks Zone Rundown. We'll be doing a breakdown. I'll be doing a deeper breakdown on Clint Kubiak with Ryan McMillan. So that'll be on at 8:30 Pacific time. So if you guys are interested in hopping over for that, I've got a whole breakdown of potential coaches that he could bring in and such. So, And I guess I'll leave you guys with that as I can't actually exit out of this for Dan. So I wish you guys all the best and have a good night.